I couldn't believe it when I saw my wife get into a strange man's car after the party. The image of her, so well-groomed, laughing with that man as if they had been intimate for years, collided with everything I knew about my reality. My feet moved out of instinct, my heart, out of denial. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Not with her. Not with me. But it was. And every second of that journey I followed, with the car in the distance, was like walking on hot coals, with every kilometer, another burned memory, another shattered certainty. I loved her. With everything. With body, soul, past and future. And she simply chose to tear me apart inside, with a smile on her lips and a touch on the shoulder from a complete stranger. The night was cold, and my mind was even colder. I followed them to a nondescript office building, the kind that looks abandoned from the outside but hides secrets behind frosted glass doors. I watched her get out of the car with him, laugh at something he whispered, and then they both disappeared through the door. I stood still inside the car, my fingers gripping the steering wheel as if I wanted to rip it off. I could have just gone back, pretended I hadn't seen anything, that it was a mistake, but my intuition screamed. This was real. And there was no going back. I waited. I waited like a man on death row waits for last call. When she came out, hours later, her hair was messy, her eyes half closed, her smile too loose. I knew what that meant. I knew. That night, I didn't sleep. I tossed and turned in the bed where we slept together, smelling her perfume still on the pillow. The pillow she swore she could only sleep hugging. I remembered the conversations in the dark, the promises, the way she said that only I could make her feel safe, wanted. Was it all a lie? Or worse, it was all true, until it wasn't anymore. The next day, she came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the forehead, asked if I had slept well. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break everything. But instead, I answered with a crooked smile. And that's when I understood, I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand. I needed to see how far she would go with this. And most of all, I needed to get even. But an amount of payback she would never forget. It wasn't just a matter of revenge, it was justice. It was for me. For the man I had been. For the one she had killed. Little by little, I started putting the pieces together. Every deleted message, every new apology, every change in behavior. She wasn't just cheating on me, she believed she was above any consequences. And that hurt. But it also gave me strength. Because if she thought she was going to get away with this, she still didn't know the man who built everything we have together. Every penny, every achievement, every space in that house was the result of my effort. And I would make sure she knew it. Her and the unfortunate man who had played the role of lover, and who, for some reason, seemed so sure of himself. As if he knew something I didn't. I started investigating. I spoke to people close to me, I looked through records, I sought out a lawyer. I found out more than I wanted. It wasn't just physical betrayal. It was financial dishonesty. Manipulation. Deception on several levels. She used my name, my trust, my signature to move accounts that I didn't even know existed. Money that left here and ended up who knows where. And what's more, she used this money to pay for trips and gifts for both of us. I financed my own humiliation. As if that wasn't enough, I still had to watch her little acts of acting out on a daily basis, the fake affection, the forced compliments, the nights she would lie next to me after coming back from him. I would touch her, without knowing that she was no longer mine. Until one day, she said she wanted to talk. I thought it would be time for her to confess. But no. She wanted a divorce. Simple, direct. She said she needed to rediscover herself, that she wasn't happy anymore. She didn't mention anyone. She didn't mention the man in the car, or the hidden accounts, or the nights she'd been missing. She'd underestimated me so much that she thought I'd swallow it all with a handshake. And there, faced with her audacity, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because I already knew everything. I already had the proof. I'd already prepared every step of what was to come. And she had no idea. I accepted the divorce with the calm of someone who is about to turn the tables. When we entered the courtroom, she was radiant. She was wearing a new dress, perhaps a gift from her lover. Beside her, an arrogant, confident lawyer who already thought the case was a winner. I, silent, just watched. And when the judge gave us the floor, I asked to present evidence. Videos. Audios. Bank transactions. I had everything. From the meetings with her lover to the statements of the illegal transactions she had made in my name. Her face changed color. Her lawyer tried to stop her, but it was too late. The entire courtroom saw. Heard. Read. And then came the silence. The kind of silence that weighs on the air, that paralyzes. And in that moment, she understood, she had lost everything. The judge was clear. Fraud. Abuse of trust. Violation of marital duties. Not only would she not be entitled to anything, but she would also be held legally liable for ideological falsehood. The lover. It turned out that he was also involved in the transactions. He used my wife as a front man in a larger scheme. Both were indicted. And me? I left with my head held high. Not only clean, but strengthened. And with something even better, freedom. For a while, I thought I would never be able to love again. That pain would change me forever. But life has a subtle way of surprising us. I met someone. By chance. At a time when I least expected it. And she knew nothing of my story. She knew the man I had become, not the one who had been destroyed. And little by little, I began to believe again. But to this day, there is one question that haunts my mind every night before I go to sleep. Something that was left pending at that last hearing. A detail that went unnoticed. A look, perhaps. A gesture. A shadow. Something that indicates that, perhaps, not everything has been revealed. That the hole is even deeper. That the final secret, the one that changes everything, is still hidden, and will only be revealed when I am ready to face what lies behind the absolute truth. What if I told you that the greatest betrayal wasn't hers? What if the real enemy is much closer than I imagined? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize cheating. All stories are fictional, created to show how devastating the impact of infidelity is on the life of those who truly love. The moral is clear: betrayal hurts, destroys and changes lives forever. Prepare yourself. Next, you will hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good story. Daniel and Julia were always the kind of couple who would be the envy of friends at dinner parties and in any room they entered together. They had a presence that effortlessly drew attention, as if an invisible energy enveloped them and silently told them that they belonged together. He, a respected, meticulous, and calm-spoken tax lawyer, had built his career based on discipline, long nights of study, and unquestionable ethics. Julia, on the other hand, was the communications director at a multinational technology company, an elegant, articulate woman with a sensitivity that charmed even the most skeptical. The two had met during a law seminar years earlier, and from the first coffee they shared between lectures, they felt that there was something there, not an overwhelming passion at first sight, but a rare connection that grew with each conversation, each comfortable silence, each exchange of glances in the middle of a crowd. They got married 2 years later. The wedding was discreet but sophisticated, with few guests and many sincere vows exchanged. The house where they now lived seemed to have come out of a contemporary architecture catalogue, but it was built with thoughtful choices, each object carrying a memory, each room reflecting part of the couple's personality. They had a well-defined routine, but it was far from cold. There were rituals that connected them: breakfast together, even if it was rushed, Sunday walks at dusk, movies watched with a blanket and wine on the weekends. It was these little things that sustained their marriage like a stone castle, seemingly unshakable. Daniel had always been a calm man, with an attentive gaze and a calculating mind. Behind his gentle face and calm speech, there was a sharp intelligence and an enormous capacity for observation. Julia, although more outgoing and given to affection, was also a strategist by nature. She knew how to read environments, decipher intentions, and was rarely caught off guard. Together, they formed a respected couple. Not only admired for their appearances, but for that intimate connection that seemed too sincere to be doubted. She loved to surprise him with little things, a new shirt left on the bed with a simple note, an improvised dinner in the middle of the week with his favorite dish, a touch on the shoulder during a family gathering that said more than words. He, in turn, showed love in quieter actions, checking her car without being asked, organizing her tax paperwork without her asking, making sure the flowers in the garden were always fresh, flowers that she loved so much. They had faced difficulties, of course. No couple is free from instability. 2 years after their marriage, Daniel went through a serious professional crisis when the firm he had helped found lost an important contract and had to lay off almost half of its employees. During this time, Julia was his rock. She put up with his sleepless nights, his emotional absences, his contained irritation. She didn't complain, she didn't demand anything beyond an occasional presence. And when he finally got back on his feet, it was she who gave him a standing ovation, even though the rebuilding process hadn't been easy for either of them. They both came from different families. Julia, the only child of separated parents, grew up watching her mother being left out as she tried to keep up appearances so her daughter wouldn't notice the impending collapse of the home. This made her strong, but it also taught her to never give in to signs that reminded her of the mistakes of her childhood. Daniel, on the other hand, came from a traditional family, marked by his father's rigidity and his mother's silent submission. He was the oldest of 3 brothers and learned early on that responsibility came before pleasure. Perhaps that's why the two complemented each other so much, she, sensitive and intuitive, afraid of repeating family patterns, he, rational and constant, trying to be the opposite of what he saw at home. Together, they seemed to balance between light and shadow. In recent years, their professional lives have taken them to different rhythms. Julia began traveling more frequently for international projects. Daniel, now more settled, preferred to avoid commuting and focus on the internal growth of the office. These changes altered the couple's routine. The nights they would have dinner together became less frequent. Their conversations began to be interrupted by meetings, work messages, and accumulated fatigue. Even so, they continued to make an effort to reconnect on the weekends, planning short getaways to the countryside, dinners at new restaurants, and trips to the theater. Passion had given way to partnership, to the deep affection of those who built a shared life on solid foundations, although silence began to subtly occupy spaces previously filled with laughter and spontaneous touches. Julia sometimes felt that something in her was changing. I didn't know what to say. It was as if a dormant restlessness began to stir within him, as if his soul was asking for something his mind could not name. She felt grateful for everything she had, but at the same time, she began to wonder if she was still seen in the same way she had when they first met. If it still aroused desire. If it was still enough. These doubts, however, were not shared. She kept them to herself, as if she were afraid of appearing ungrateful in the face of a seemingly perfect life. Daniel, in turn, did not understand the signs. Or maybe you noticed them, but chose to ignore them. His logic made him think that if there were no explicit complaints, then everything was fine. And at that point, he failed to see the chasms that were beginning to open beneath his feet. Close friends noticed that something had changed. They commented, at casual lunches or parties, that Julia was more distracted, less present. That Daniel was more reserved than usual. But as in so many other apparently solid relationships, no one dared to delve deeper into the questions. The couple with the perfect facade was still the ideal couple. And everyone preferred to maintain that illusion. Even them. Julia started accepting more invitations to work events, even when they weren't mandatory. He spent more time getting ready. She posted photos of herself, captioned with phrases that sounded like veiled outbursts. Daniel, although he noticed these small deviations, attributed everything to fatigue and the pressure of the position she held. I didn't question it. I just waited for the phase to pass. It was on one of those ordinary nights, when silence weighed more than presence, that Daniel decided to rekindle the flame. He planned a surprise trip to the same place where they had spent their honeymoon. He booked the hotel, talked to her boss to make sure she had days off, and prepared everything in secret. I wanted to see her smile like before. He wanted to hear her laugh with that freedom that had won him over from the beginning. Deep down, I desperately needed confirmation that there was still an us. But when he handed her the tickets, with a card he had written himself, Julia hesitated. He said he loved the idea, but that he was in a complicated phase, with an important delivery at work. He promised they would go the following month. He swore he wanted to, but he couldn't at that moment. Daniel swallowed his frustration with a calm smile, as he always did, and said he understood. But something inside him was already beginning to crumble. Time passed. And with him, the subtle distance deepened. The house no longer vibrated with the same sounds. It took longer for their eyes to meet. Touch became rare, like a scheduled visit. And yet, no one talked about a crisis. Neither of them dared to name what they both, in different ways, already felt. Because naming is giving form. And to shape is to recognize that something is wrong. And no one wants to be the first to admit that the castle has started to bite. And it was precisely at this stage, on this fragile terrain, that the invitations came. A company party to celebrate a successful project. Daniel, even though a little reluctant, agreed to go. After all, he supported his wife's career and knew that those occasions were important to her. He put on his best suit, chose a tie that she had given him as a gift some time ago, and followed her side as he had so many times before. But something about that night would forever be etched in his memory. A detail, a choice, an instant. And in that moment, something happened. Something he never expected. Something that would silently begin the end of everything he thought he knew. The party for Julia's company was held in a modern event space with soft lighting and an elegant bar in the background. There was background music, waiters circulating with glasses of sparkling wine, and an atmosphere of celebration for the end of an important cycle. It was the kind of environment where everyone seemed to be perfectly aligned with their own image of success. Daniel walked among the guests with that reserved posture that was usual for him, greeting with a slight smile and listening more than he spoke. He knew exactly how to behave on these occasions, even if he never felt completely at ease. Julia, on the other hand, moved as if she were part of the place. She greeted colleagues naturally, chatted spontaneously, and seemed to live a lighter version of herself. Watching her from afar brought Daniel a mixture of pride and an uncomfortable twinge of distance. She seemed to shine there in a way that he hadn't seen in a long time when they were alone. During the evening, as she introduced him to some colleagues, Daniel noticed small details that left an uncomfortable impression. She was more restless, distracted, her gaze wandering from time to the front door. And although she spoke to everyone, there was a certain urgency in her gestures, as if she was waiting for someone. When discreetly asked if there was something wrong, Julia responded with a quick smile, saying that she was just tired from the intense week of work and that she probably wouldn't stay until the end of the party. Still, she stayed there, chatting with a group while he walked away to get another drink. It was at that moment, when he returned with 2 glasses of wine, that Daniel saw her laugh at something said by a man he didn't know. The man lightly touched her arm, and she, leaning forward, returned it with an expression that he already knew well. It was the kind of smile she gave when she wanted to be noticed. That sparked something uncomfortable inside him. It wasn't immediate jealousy, nor anger. It was doubt. A feeling that bit slowly, like an ingrown toenail that bothers before it really hurts. Julia hadn't mentioned that man before. And their proximity wasn't typical of a first conversation. She watched for a few more minutes, feigning interest in a conversation nearby, while her attention was completely focused on their body language. When she saw him looking, she immediately turned her body away from the man and came towards him, trying to disguise her discomfort with a quick kiss and a casual comment about how great the wine was. He just nodded, but inside, the first thread of distrust was already tangling in his mind. Over the next few weeks, something changed in Daniel. A kind of silent vigilance set in. He began to pay attention to schedules, patterns, and unexcused breaks. Julia, who had been so present, now left the house earlier and came back later. There was always a new meeting, a team dinner, a networking event. The excuses multiplied, but none of them rang false enough to justify a direct accusation. He knew he couldn't act on impressions alone. So he started recording. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. He needed the truth, the raw truth, no matter how painful it was. On a random Tuesday, Daniel decided to leave work early, without warning. He wanted to surprise her, maybe have lunch together, rekindle some of the intimacy they seemed to have lost. He got in his car and drove to the building where she worked. When he arrived, he waited in a cafe across the street, discreetly observing the movement. In the middle of the afternoon, when she texted him that she was still at the office reviewing a presentation, he saw her leave in a hurry, with the same man from the party. They got into a dark car together and headed toward the other side of the city. Daniel followed them. He didn't know exactly why, he just knew that he had to see it through. The journey was short, but it seemed to last forever. They stopped at a discreet restaurant, far from the city center, with a discreet facade and an intimate atmosphere. They went in and were shown to a table in the back. Daniel waited outside for almost an hour, anxiety tightening his chest, anger trying to seep in. When they left, laughing, he saw them get back in the car. This time, they didn't go to work or to either of their homes. They stopped at a hotel. Small, discreet, but tasteful. A place you don't choose at random. In that instant, Daniel's world shook. The ground beneath his feet didn't crack all at once, it sank slowly, like quicksand. Everything he had been avoiding thinking about took on concrete, painful, undeniable form. They were together. Julia was with another man. There was no more room for doubt, for assumptions, for the kind justifications that his rational mind insisted on finding. His wife had made a choice. She had allowed herself to cross a line. And, worse, she had done so without hesitation. He didn't confront her. Not then. He went home in silence, his heart pounding with a mixture of anguish and clarity. He sat on the couch and spent the entire night staring into space, reliving years of memories, trying to identify where things had gone off the rails. The next day, she came home as she always did, bringing a bottle of wine, smiling as she said it had been an exhausting meeting. He listened to her, pretending to believe her, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the following days, Daniel hired an investigator. He knew that if he were to confront her, he would need proof. Not just for himself, but for what would come next. Because he was already starting to plan the next step. It wouldn't just be a separation. It wouldn't just be the end of a marriage. It would be a response. A stance. An act of emotional and rational justice. And, above all, a turning point. The investigator didn't take long to confirm everything he already knew. There were records. Videos. Audios. Images that left no room for denial. Julia and the man had been seeing each other for months. They had traveled together under the pretext of work events. They had a parallel, secret routine built in the gaps of their marriage. Despite everything, Daniel didn't freak out. He didn't explode. He stayed there, living with her, listening to the same excuses, accepting the same cold hugs, sharing the same bed that now seemed like a minefield. He observed with different eyes, listened with different sensitivity. And, little by little, his pain was transformed into a strategy. He wouldn't be the abandoned man who cries over his loss. He would be the one who bounces back. But without rushing. Without fuss. Everything in due time. And the right time has come. It was another one of those corporate parties, this time with even more pomp, celebrating the closing of $1 million contract. Julia insisted that he go, and he accepted. He knew the man would be there. And he wanted to be there. Arriving at the venue, Daniel observed everything with the precision of a surgeon. She acted as always, sociable, charismatic, elegant. But her eyes sought the other. Daniel saw them getting closer, talking in the corner, exchanging glances that should never exist between married colleagues. That pierced him like a blade. But he didn't back down. He didn't show anything. He just waited for the right moment. When the party ended and she quietly walked out to the parking lot, he already knew what he was going to find. And what he saw, parked a few meters away, only confirmed it. She got into the car with him. She laughed. She leaned over. She touched his face. And then the car drove off. Daniel, alone in his own car, followed them. His hands were shaking, but not from insecurity. It was a tremor of anticipation. His heart was beating fast, not from jealousy, but from knowing that he was about to face something that no man wants to witness. They stopped at a rented apartment, one of those seasonal ones, far from the eyes of acquaintances. Daniel parked at a safe distance and stood there, motionless, as the minutes dragged by. When he finally decided to leave, there was no more pain. Only certainty. He had seen. He knew. And now, he would act. What Julia didn't know, what she couldn't have foreseen even in her worst nightmares, was that the betrayal would only be the beginning of her downfall. Because what Daniel had discovered about her went far beyond the secret encounters and the lies. There was something hidden. A secret so deep and dirty that it would change not only the course of their marriage, but also her destiny. And it was about to be revealed. On the morning of the trial, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He looked to the side and saw the bed made, untouched, which had become common in recent weeks, since Julia spent nights out with excuses that no longer needed to be said. He didn't say anything. He just got up, shaved with precision and chose a dark suit that conveyed sobriety and dominance. When he left the house, he had everything he needed. Nothing had been left to chance. That morning would be definitive. And he didn't need strength, he had the truth. When he arrived at the courthouse, he saw Julia in the lobby, accompanied by her lawyer. She was impeccable, wearing a navy blue dress that matched the tone of her discreet makeup. When she saw him, she lifted her chin with an almost triumphant lightness. It was as if she knew she would come out victorious, as if this hearing was just a formality to confirm the division of assets and end, with some dignity, a marriage that she had already left behind long before she filed for divorce. Her lawyer approached first, with a polite greeting and a condescending tone. Daniel responded with controlled coldness, without taking his eyes off Julia. When they were called into the room, he took a deep breath and walked through the door as if he were entering an arena. The judge was experienced and objective. They were there to decide how to divide the assets and define the terms of the divorce. At first, everything seemed to be following the usual course. Julia presented herself as the injured party, outlining a narrative of emotional distance, lack of affection, and a marriage that had become suffocating. She said, with a mixture of sadness and firmness, that she had never cheated out of malice, but out of loneliness. That she deserved a new chance at happiness, that what she sought was not revenge, but freedom. Her voice, sweet and choked at strategic moments, was constructed with the precision of someone who knew how to manipulate an audience. Daniel listened in silence. Every now and then he made brief notes, without even looking up. The judge watched him with interest. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel slowly stood up, adjusted his jacket, and asked permission to present documents and evidence that he considered relevant to the trial. Julia's lawyer tried to intervene, saying that any material outside the initial petition could not be considered. But the judge nodded and allowed it. This was the moment Daniel had been preparing for weeks. He began by handing over folders with bank records. Transfers in his name to accounts he had never authorized. The judge leafed through the papers, curious. Julia's lawyer frowned. She, in turn, looked away for the first time since they had entered the room. Daniel then projected images and videos on the courtroom screen that had been legally obtained through an expert analysis. He showed Julia entering bank branches with documents that did not belong to her. He showed statements that linked these transactions to expenses involving flights, accommodations, purchases, and investments that he had never known about. A discreet murmur ran through the room. Julia tried to compose herself. She said that it was all a misinterpretation, that it was just a way to move funds for personal investments, but her tone of voice was no longer as firm. And that was when Daniel asked the question. He looked directly at the judge and asked to call a witness. The name sounded strange to those present. He was the manager of an investment brokerage firm where, according to the documents, there was an account in Daniel's name. But Daniel had never opened an account there. When the man entered the room and was sworn in, his speech was concise. He confirmed that Julia, using forged powers of attorney, had opened an account in her husband's name and had moved hundreds of thousands of reis over the course of almost 2 years. Daniel looked at her, for the first time with latent anger escaping his eyes. He told the judge, in a serious voice, that all of this was not just marital betrayal. It was a crime. That he had entrusted her with his signature, his life, his name, and she had used it as a shield to divert resources for her own benefit, to fund a parallel lifestyle built on lies. Julia, under pressure, tried to defend herself. She said she had never used the money for anything other than what was rightfully hers. She felt she was not receiving the proper amount of value in the marriage, and that this had been an attempt to protect herself financially. The judge, seriously, asked her if she had proof that she had been authorized to open those accounts. She hesitated. Her lawyer, already visibly disconcerted, asked for a break. But it was too late. Daniel then pulled out the most shocking thing he had, an audio recording. It was a recording of a conversation between Julia and her lover. In the excerpt, she said that Daniel would never find out, that he trusted her so much that he would sign any paper without reading it. And that if one day everything went wrong, she would still walk away with half of everything, because he would never have the courage to fight back. The words cut through the air like blades. The intonation was mocking, certain. And the last sentence echoed like a punch, "He is a brilliant man, but stupid when it comes to me." Julia shrugged her shoulders in her chair. The face that had previously conveyed control now brimmed with despair. The judge paused for a long time, consulting the documents, processing the evidence. The silence was broken only by Daniel's low voice, almost a whisper, addressed directly to her. He said that his love for her had been real. That he had never doubted her integrity. That what hurt most was not the adultery or the theft, but the contempt. The certainty with which she believed he would never find out. That she could manipulate him forever. Julia was crying now. But her tears no longer held the weight of regret, only the bitter taste of imminent defeat. The judge resumed speaking. He said that, given the evidence, he would not only deny any request for division of assets, but would also recommend opening criminal proceedings for false information, fraud and misuse of identity. That the case went beyond the limits of a common separation. There were serious elements there that deserved a thorough investigation. Julia put her hands over her face, as if she wanted to disappear. Her lawyer closed his eyes tightly, shaking his head slightly, aware of the gravity of what he had just witnessed. The trial ended with the decision to immediately freeze the accounts under investigation and release all assets to Daniel. He remained silent. There was no celebration, no visible relief. Only the dignity of someone who knew he had faced hell head-on and come back on his feet. When he left the courtroom, he took a deep breath. The sky was gray, but there was a strange peace in the air. As if something had finally come to an end. Julia sat for a few minutes after the judge left. Her world, built on so many layers of lies, had crumbled in one morning. She tried to look up at Daniel one last time, but his back was already turned. And in that moment, she understood that she had not only lost a marriage, she had lost the respect of a man who had once loved her more than anything in the world. And what she never imagined, was that this trial was not the end. Because there was something else. Something that would make her fall even deeper. And it was about to happen. News of what had happened in court spread quickly, as happens with everything that smacks of scandal involving apparently successful and admired people. It didn't take long for Julia's co-workers to start treating her with distance, leaving emails unanswered, canceling meetings without justification, and giving her disapproving looks disguised as indifference. She was removed from the company under the argument of internal investigation into conduct incompatible with the organization's principles, and although the official statement did not mention names or details, everyone knew what had happened. The board preferred not to get directly involved, but the message was clear: her presence tarnished the institution's image. Her lover, in turn, disappeared overnight, supposedly transferred to a branch in another state, although behind the scenes many whispered that the removal was due to pressure from his own wife, who had received copies of the documents sent by Daniel to the courts, with details that could no longer be swept under the rug. Daniel, after the trial, did not return directly home. "I needed time to assimilate what had come to light definitively." He got in the car and drove aimlessly for hours, just feeling the asphalt under the wheels and the weight of the silence around him. He stopped at a remote viewpoint, the same one where, years before, he had proposed. He looked at the horizon with the same intensity as before, but with eyes marked by experiences that had made him another man. Anger was no longer the driving force. Not even the pain. What remained now was a clear conscience, an absolute clarity that he had done everything right. And, above all, a new urgency, to start again, but with different eyes. In the days that followed, he reorganized his life in a precise way. He restructured his office hours, started to take better care of his health, resumed hobbies that had been abandoned over time, and decided to move out of the house where he lived with Julia. The house, although now legally under his ownership, was an emotional mausoleum, and he did not want to continue to be surrounded by poisoned memories. He bought a new apartment, smaller, with fewer rooms, but with a spectacular view of the city. Each piece of furniture he chose was part of a new cycle. Each decorative detail carried the symbolism of a new beginning. There were no more empty spaces to be filled by ghosts. There was only him, and the chance to be the master of his own peace. Julia, on the other hand, did not have the same privilege of rebuilding herself with serenity. With her name tarnished, her face linked to unflattering news on the internet, and the judicial freezing of the accounts involved in the fraud, she began to face practical and existential difficulties. Her friends evaporated, her family pretended not to know anything, and even her mother, who had always defended her even in the worst moments, preferred to withdraw, ashamed. She had to leave the luxurious apartment she rented with her lover and began to live in a modest space, paying with savings that had not yet been frozen. She looked for work in smaller agencies, without success. Her bad reputation was a mark that preceded her, even in places where no one knew her personally. A stain that seemed to scream her name before she even opened her mouth. She tried to get closer to Daniel twice, first through written messages, long, emotional, full of apologies and complaints, and then by attempting to visit him in person at his new address. She received no response. All she found was an envelope taped to the door, with a single sentence written in her impeccable handwriting: "You have chosen your path, now follow it until the end." It was there, in front of that closed door, that Julia finally understood the weight of the consequence. She cried in silence, leaning against the hallway wall, as if the world had become a space too narrow to fit her existence. There was no more Daniel. There was no more career. Nor admiration from others. There was only the echo of her own choices. Meanwhile, Daniel was approaching a new woman, albeit cautiously. She was a colleague he had met years before at a conference, but whom he met again by chance at a lecture. They talked with the ease of someone who was in no hurry. She, mature, intelligent, and sensitive, saw something in him that few others did, a man who had been hurt but chose not to harbor bitterness. Their encounters began with coffee, then lunch, then entire weekends spent sharing books, laughter, and comfortable silences. She did not ask him invasive questions about the past. She simply listened when he, little by little, felt ready to talk. And that was how he realized he was ready to start over. That his self-love no longer depended on being desired by someone, but on recognizing his own worth. No matter how much he moved on, there was still a part of the story that Daniel needed to close. And that happened when he received a notification from the public prosecutor's office, informing him that the criminal proceedings against Julia were underway and that he, as the injured party, should appear to give a new statement. When he entered the room, he saw her for the first time since the trial. She was different. Thinner, her eyes dull, her hair tied up in a sloppy way. When she saw him, she immediately lowered her head, as if she no longer had the strength to sustain her own name. During the testimony, Daniel maintained his composure. He spoke clearly, presented additional documents, and confirmed all the necessary information. Julia remained silent, as if her presence was only a shadow of what she once was. When the session ended, she approached him discreetly in the hallway, her voice cracking, as if speaking hurt. She said she did not expect forgiveness, that she did not even know if she still had the right to exist with anyone after what she had done. She said that everything she had lost was still less than the shame of having lost his admiration. Daniel looked at her for a few seconds, feeling a strange weight in his chest. It was not hatred. It was pity. A deep pity for someone who had drowned in her own mistakes and who now clung to any shred of dignity. He only said that she needed to forgive herself before asking anyone else for forgiveness. And that he honestly hoped that one day she would understand what she had destroyed. On the way out, in the parking lot, he ran into an old colleague who greeted him enthusiastically and said he had heard the story. The conversation was brief, but Daniel realized that the subject was already part of the collective memory, like one of those tragedies that everyone talks about for a while before moving on. He smiled quietly, thanked her for her concern, and continued walking to his car. On the way back, the phone rang. It was his new partner, asking if he wanted to have dinner at home or go out. He smiled and said he preferred to have dinner at home, but that he would cook himself. He wanted to surprise her. Arriving at the apartment, he put on some light music, lit some candles and prepared a simple but thoughtful dish. When she arrived, he greeted her with a kiss on the forehead and a serene look. They sat at the table, toasted with white wine and talked about light things. She looked at him with affection, as if she saw a whole man, not for the pieces that remained, but for the strength he had to rebuild himself. Later, on the balcony, with the illuminated city at her feet, she asked if he regretted finding out everything. Daniel thought for a few seconds before answering. I said no. That hurt, yes, more than anything else I had ever felt. But the truth set him free. And if I hadn't gone through all that, I might never have learned to choose myself. And in that moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, gratitude. Not for what he suffered, but for what he survived. For the man he managed to become despite everything. For the love he felt again, without fear, without haste, with deeper roots. And somewhere in the city, in a dark and silent room, Julia stared at the ceiling, reliving every moment she had believed she was smart enough to get away with it. She thought about every detail of the trial, every sentence Daniel had said, the look in his eyes that pierced her with disappointment, and the last thing she had read in his farewell letter left on the table the day he had left their house. A sentence she could not forget, you could have had it all. But you chose to destroy the rarest thing in me, trust. She closed her eyes, and the emptiness around her seemed to whisper everything she had lost. There were no screams, no tears. Just a heavy silence. A silence that was now her only company. And that, little by little, was becoming unbearable. From the moment Daniel left the courtroom after giving his final statement as an injured party in the criminal case against Julia, something inside him finally gave way. It wasn't immediate relief, nor was it a feeling of victory. What emerged was a rare kind of peace, the peace that comes not from revenge but from the restoration of one's own wholeness. He had gone through all the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and finally acceptance. The woman he had shared so many years with was no more, or perhaps she had never existed in the way he had imagined. It didn't matter. The Daniel who now walked the streets, feeling the cold night air and hearing only his own footsteps, was a restored man, even if there were still ruins inside that time might never completely erase. The pain hadn't gone away. It had simply learned how to behave. Despite everything, Daniel was not indifferent to what was happening to Julia. He had been silently following the developments in her situation with the public prosecutor's office. He knew that the criminal case was moving forward and that, most likely, she would face tougher hearings, perhaps even a conviction, depending on the judge's interpretation. That was not what he wanted, at least not consciously. He was not a vengeful man. He wanted justice, and justice was different from punishment. Still, when he found out that she had requested, through her lawyer, a conciliation hearing to try to negotiate an alternative sentence, he felt an unexpected pain. Not for her. But for everything they had once represented. For the break. For the story that the two of them, for so long, believed they were building with love. The hearing was not public, and Daniel chose not to be present. The prosecutor represented him, following exactly the instructions he had given in private. Julia appeared with her head down, with the exhausted expression of someone who no longer seeks to justify herself. The settlement proposal was not accepted. There was no way to get around the facts with an apology or community service. The crimes were documented, the evidence was clear, the embezzled funds were concrete. And, above all, there was intent. Julia had acted in a calculated manner. She knew what she was doing. She knew that she was using Daniel's name to benefit herself. And the judicial system, although flawed in many aspects, could not allow that type of behavior to go unpunished. The case would continue. Outside of that legal mess, life had to go on. Daniel launched himself into new projects with the same dedication he always had, but with a different energy. No longer to prove something to the world, but to keep moving. He participated in events in the field, collaborated with social initiatives focused on legal education, and, little by little, became a reference figure in his professional community. Alongside his new partner, who was now a real part of his life, he discovered a different type of relationship, more mature, less dependent, built on the basis of mutual respect and a freedom that did not threaten, but rather strengthened. They shared fewer promises and more presence. They did not need to promise eternal love, because they were enough for each other on good days and supported each other on difficult days. At the same time, Julia faced the emptiness of her own existence with a mixture of disbelief and contained despair. There were still nights when she dreamed of the times when she was admired, of the mornings when she woke up next to Daniel and believed that the world was safe. At other times, regret came, but it was not a pure, noble regret, the kind that elevates the spirit. It was a lament mixed with anger, shame and self-pity. She had lost everything. Everything that could have been hers by merit if she had not tried to steal by shortcuts. She now lived in a small apartment, with late rent, second-hand furniture and a silence that seemed to grow with each dawn. She tried, at times, to seek support in groups of women in crisis, but when she told her story, she saw the looks on their faces change, the words become colder. There was no room there for someone who had destroyed her own life with her own hands. There, the pain was unfair. Hers was deserved. And that hurt. One day, Daniel received a letter. Handwritten. He recognized the handwriting the instant he saw the envelope. It didn't open immediately. He left it on the table for hours, until curiosity was greater than resistance. The letter was long, but not melodramatic. Julia spoke with a lucidity he hadn't expected. He admitted his mistakes, acknowledged the destruction he had caused, and said he wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness, because he understood that you don't ask for it, you build it, and that perhaps there would never be time or space for that between them. She said she just wanted one last thing, for him to know that deep down, she loved him. Who always loved. But she was a woman who never knew what to do with true love. who always feared being left behind, diminished, and therefore always sought to ensure herself with security, even if that security was an illusion built on lies. That, in trying to control everything, he lost what was most sincere. The letter ended with a simple sentence, without appeal, without drama: "You survived me. I haven't learned how to survive myself yet." Daniel read the entire letter twice. Afterwards, he kept it in a box he kept with important papers, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for his own history. He didn't answer her. And he didn't tell anyone that he received it. It was a moment just for him. A chapter closed, but still pulsating, like a scar that itches every now and then just to remind you that it's still there. Life went on, but that past was part of the foundation. He accepted that now. That same week, he was invited to give a talk at an event about ethics and interpersonal relationships in the corporate environment. At first, he refused. Then he reconsidered. He felt that perhaps it was time to transform his pain into some kind of contribution. He took the stage with confidence, spoke about choices, about the value of trust, about the irreparable damage that betrayal, whether emotional or financial, can cause to the structure of a life. He received a standing ovation. And when he got off the stage, he was approached by young lawyers, students, and professionals from a variety of fields who wanted to thank him for hearing someone speak with such transparency. He didn't tell his personal story. There was no need. But he was there, invisible in every word. One rainy night, weeks later, Daniel was having dinner with his partner in a quiet restaurant. They talked about the idea of taking a long trip, maybe a few months living abroad, experiencing other cultures. She smiled excitedly, and he allowed himself to dream. That was when, as he was leaving, he saw Julia across the street. She was alone, with a crooked umbrella and a grocery bag. She saw him too. Her gaze wavered for a second. Daniel stopped, unsure whether to wave, but she just turned away, disappearing down the wet sidewalk without looking back. He stood there for a moment, without anger, without sadness, just with the strange feeling that this, yes, was the end. Not the tragic end, full of screams and slamming doors. But the silent end, the one that truly ends things. Because now there was nothing left to say. Or to feel. The past was just that, past. And the future, finally, belonged to him. And he would not share it with anyone who would reduce him to a lesser role than he deserved. He had found something precious, much more than the justice he sought in the courts. He had found peace. And even though the world kept turning, with new stories, new pain, new beginnings, that story, the story of Daniel and Julia, was about to have a final chapter. A chapter that would not bring redemption. But it would bring something even rarer. A fair ending. And surprising. The days following Daniel and Julia's unexpected encounter on the street were unusually calm. There was something in her gaze that night, that silent, almost automatic averted glance that no longer carried the weight of someone seeking confrontation but the resignation of someone who no longer expected to be seen, that stayed in Daniel's mind for longer than he realized. That image didn't make him angry, or feel sorry, or feel any kind of longing. It was just a belated mirror, a concrete reflection of the abysmal distance that separated them now. Lives that no longer touched each other at any point. And even though the past still pulsed in loose memories, that place, at that intersection soaked in rain and history, had been the last crossing. That night, when he got home, Daniel opened a bottle of wine that he had been saving for years and shared it with his partner in silence. There was no toast. There was no speech. Just a long look between the two of them, as if they both knew, without needing to say it, that something was over for good. The apartment he now lived in was increasingly reflecting his personality. A new bookshelf occupied the previously empty wall, paintings they had chosen together filled the hallway, and the details of the decor carried meaning. They were not merely aesthetic, they were memories in the making. And with this new construction also came a sense of normality, something he had long believed he would never feel again. But time has a relentless way of rearranging everything, and even the deepest wounds, when left untreated, turn into scars that no longer hurt to the touch. Still, one afternoon, an unexpected call brought the past back to haunt him. It was Daniel's lawyer, announcing that a new hearing had been scheduled. It was not a criminal hearing. It was an extraordinary hearing requested by Julia's defense, based on a last-minute appeal. She claimed to have evidence that part of the embezzled funds belonged to an undeclared joint investment, and requested Daniel's presence to clarify the matter. Upon receiving the news, Daniel felt an immediate discomfort. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He had already closed that chapter mentally and emotionally. Being in front of her once again, even for the last time, was like reopening a door that he had closed with great effort. Still, he showed up. Not because he believed anything would be different, but because he knew that running away would be like giving her one last control over his routine. And he was no longer willing to give up space. The room where the hearing was held was smaller, more discreet, with few professionals present. Julia entered a few minutes later, visibly weakened. She was thinner, her face pale, and dark circles under her eyes. She wore sober, almost dull clothing, as if she wanted to disappear into the room. She avoided looking at him directly. She sat next to her new lawyer, an insecure young man who barely concealed his nervousness in Daniel's presence. The judge, a woman with a firm voice and direct gaze, asked for the session to begin and for the plaintiff to present the new documents. Julia then asked to speak. She wanted to speak herself. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but she insisted. The judge allowed it. What followed was an unexpected speech. Julia did not present any documents. Did not display statements or bank details. Instead, he asked that the hearing be recorded in minutes in his exact words. He said that when he filed the petition, he still believed he could try to rebuild some of the dignity he had lost. That she searched for something that connected her to the idea that she was also a victim of herself. But in the last few days, he realized he didn't need a piece of the money. I needed to end that cycle with truth. And the truth was that there was no joint investment. There was no value that could be fairly attributed to it. Everything that happened, she said, looking directly at Daniel, was motivated by fear. Fear of being left, of being forgotten, of not being enough. He tried to control the narrative of his own life, and in doing so he destroyed everything that was sincere in it. He asked the judge to dismiss the case. That I didn't want anything. That he just needed to get out of there with some shred of dignity that he could rebuild with his own hands. Daniel remained silent. The judge agreed, recorded it in the minutes, and closed the session. As she stood up, Julia hesitated. She looked at him one last time, as if seeking not forgiveness, but understanding. And she said just one sentence, in a tone that was barely audible, "Thank you for not destroying me more than I already have." He didn't answer. He just watched her leave. And he felt, at that moment, that for the first time she was saying something true. In the following days, something unexpected happened. Daniel began to be approached by media outlets wanting to interview him. The case, which had become public due to the criminal action, was now drawing attention due to the way he had handled the situation. A man who had been betrayed, financially harmed, exposed in court, and yet had acted with coolness, composure and intelligence. He refused the first requests. He didn't want to turn his story into a spectacle. But when he talked to his partner, he realized that perhaps he could use the exposure for something bigger. It was then that he agreed to participate in a conference on ethics and trust in personal and corporate relationships, where he recounted his story soberly, without sensationalism, and with a clarity that touched those present. At the end, one of the organizers approached him with a proposal, to write a book about the process of personal reconstruction after multiple betrayals, emotional, legal and moral. At first, he hesitated. But then he understood that telling his story was not about reliving the past. It was about freeing it once and for all. While Daniel was starting this new project, Julia was quietly moving in another direction. She had signed up for a volunteer program that offered legal support to vulnerable women. She used her previous professional experience to provide legal advice on simple cases, without pay. She didn't talk about her past. No one there knew her full name or the details of her downfall. But for the first time in years, she was doing something without expecting anything in return. And, in silence, she was beginning to understand what humility meant. One afternoon, while Daniel was reviewing the first chapters of the book, he received a voicemail from an unknown number. It was a woman named Clara, who worked as a mediator for family conflicts in underprivileged communities. She said that she had received an informal recommendation about him and that she would like to invite him to a discussion group with young people in the process of rebuilding their families. Daniel smiled. He didn't know who had given him his name, but he accepted. Maybe it was time to give the world back some of the clarity he had so hard to achieve. When he arrived at the community where the event would take place, he felt a slight chill in his stomach. It was a completely different environment from his own, but still full of stories that, although different, shared the same pain point, the breaking of trust. He spoke for almost an hour, listening in silence to each question, each story. And at the end, a young woman approached him and said that she had never thought that a man could also be betrayed and still remain whole. Daniel answered sincerely that no one leaves whole. But that it is possible to rebuild with different pieces. And that sometimes, the pieces that are left are the strongest. On the way home, he saw the reflection of the sunset in the windows of the buildings and thought about how much everything had changed. And how, despite the losses, there was still something inviolable inside him. Self-love. Integrity. The ability to start over. There were no more shadows. Just a long, clear road and a man at the wheel, guiding his own life with his hands firmly in the present. And in the distance, in another part of the city, a woman sat alone on a small balcony. With a cup of tea in her hands, she watched the sunset slowly cross the buildings. And at that moment, for the first time in a long time, she did not cry. She just felt. She felt everything she had lost. She felt everything that could have been. And she knew that the last scene was yet to come. But she would not be the one to write it. Because now, the story was in the hands of someone who knew how to transform loss into rebirth. And when it was all over, it would be impossible not to ask herself, what if it had been different? Months passed, and Daniel's life was now breathing a different air. The book that had begun as a timid proposal had become a powerful work, published under the title, The Weight of Truth, and quickly gained notoriety for its sincerity, for the depth with which it touched on the wounds that many prefer to hide. It was not an explicit autobiography, but readers felt in each line the soul of someone who had rebuilt his identity on the shards of pain. Invitations for interviews came in, proposals for ethics consultancy, calls for lectures, but he chose carefully where to appear. He did not want fame, he wanted coherence. He was discreet, but his story was no longer just his. It had become a mirror for those who had once been betrayed, humiliated or deceived and believed that there would be no life after the fall. His new companion accompanied him with silent admiration. He never claimed space in the spotlight, he preferred the backstage, the conversations before bed, the silences shared at dawn. They were accomplices, not by survival, but by choice. A new love that grew without promises, but full of presence, and that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Daniel had trusted again. Not just in her, but in life. Julia, on the other hand, lived a routine she never imagined for herself. After giving up on trying to recover something through legal means, she began to support herself with small temporary jobs. She gave private lessons, proofread texts, and did translations. She lived on the bare minimum. Each month, she had to reorganize her priorities to be able to pay the rent, internet, and basic bills. She no longer had friends, avoided relatives, and distanced herself completely from social media. She learned to walk with her head down in the hallways and to accept judgmental looks without returning any. Her hair was always tied up, her clothes simple, her shoes worn. But there was something different about her now. A strange lightness, as if, finally, she no longer wore masks. For the first time, she was just herself. And even though she still felt the weight of the past, there was no room for pretense. It was raw pain, yes, but it was real. And, in a way, that was also freedom. On a cold afternoon, Julia received a final notice from the court. The criminal case had come to an end with a sentence of 3 years of community service, in addition to partial restitution of the embezzled funds. There would be no prison, but she would have to work, without interruption, at a support center for victims of domestic violence. The irony of the punishment hit her hard. But when she arrived at the location for the first time, she was surprised by the brutality of the stories she heard. She saw women with scars on their faces, mothers running away with their children in their arms, young women humiliated and lost. For the first time, she was not the protagonist of her own pain. She was a spectator of the suffering of others, and this crushed her more intensely than any sentence. She did not try to get closer, did not try to give advice. She simply listened, organized the documents, served the coffee, kept silent. And in that silence, something changed. A type of humility that cannot be learned from books, nor from formal punishments. It was the awareness that the harm he had caused others, although different in form, hurt just as deeply. A year later, Daniel's book was adapted into a miniseries produced by a digital channel. He did not participate directly, he only authorized it because he trusted the screenwriter, who had promised to treat the subject with dignity. The series was a success, not because it made a big deal out of pain, but because it showed with delicacy and depth how love, when mistreated, turns into a knife. How trust, when broken, can turn into poison. And how justice, even when delayed, must happen. The repercussion of the work was so strong that the publisher proposed a new publication, a sequel, now with stories from other people inspired by his story. Daniel accepted, but on one condition, that they would not use their real names again, neither his nor Julia's. He wanted the work to belong to the victims, to those who would read it to heal themselves, not to him as a symbol. And that was how, even at the height of his relevance, he chose to gradually fade from the scene. The new phase of his life began with a simple invitation. An international university offered him a temporary academic residency so he could write and teach for a year. It was a chance to experience something new, together with the woman who now accompanied him with ease and admiration. They sold their apartment, kept only the essentials and left. They lived in small towns, among trees and quiet cafes, among libraries and trails in the countryside. They discovered a new way of loving, without rushing, without urgency. Daniel now wrote about topics that went beyond betrayal. He spoke about resilience, about ethical choices, about the power of reconstruction. He stopped being the betrayed man and became the man who chose not to lose himself. Julia, in turn, continued working at the community center, even after serving her sentence. Not out of obligation, but because he discovered a purpose there that he had never known in his old corporate world. She started studying again, took a technical course in social assistance and was formally hired as an assistant. The routine was tough, the salary small, but she was at peace with the simplicity that was now part of her existence. She lived alone, but not in solitude. He read a lot, wrote letters that he never sent, and took walks at dusk. Sometimes she would look at the expensive clothing windows and remember the woman she had been. And I didn't feel ashamed, I felt sorry. Because now I knew how fragile that version of her was. True strength was not in high heels or sharp speech. It was there, in the hands that served coffee to a woman in tears, in the eyes that listened to stories without interrupting, in the tired body that still found meaning in each new day. One last reunion happened. It was casual, unexpected. Years later, on a flight back home, Daniel saw her sitting a few seats ahead, reading a worn-cover book. She didn't see him. She wore no makeup, simple clothes, and a small backpack. When they landed and he passed her at the arrivals hall, he hesitated for a second. But he kept walking. Not out of contempt. But because there was nothing more to say. And that, deep down, was true closure. Not an apology, not an emotional reunion, but a conscious choice to move on. The story ended there. With a man who chose to rise up without crushing, with a woman who learned to rebuild without showing off, and with a silence that finally didn't hurt. Because now, each of them was where they were supposed to be. And the justice that life offered did not come with fanfare, but with a balance that only time can provide. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story. What touched you the most? What surprised you? Your opinion is very important to us. And if you like this narrative, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support, glamorize, and will never encourage any type of cheating. Here, we tell stories to show how it destroys, hurts, and, above all, leaves deep scars. Until the next story.